Once thought to be more fake than today's AI videos, Geoffrey, the imaginary engine, is a former Great Central Railway 8K that's another one of several backbones in maintaining Sodor's goods traffic. But when he first came to Sodor, he found himself on passenger services in Edward's absence from the Furness Railway, before he was sold to the North Western as their second dedicated goods engine following the grouping. However, he'd soon be sold back to the LNER to assist with rebuilding the network until withdrawal in the late 1950s, before his rescue from Barrow's scrapyard and transfer back to Sodor. Geoffrey's story begins in the 1910s, when the Great Central Railway, established in 1897, was closed to open in a large port in Immingham for the export of coal, and the board decided on an enlarged version of the 8A080 tender engines to support the expected increase in coal traffic. As such, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the GCR, John George Robinson, went about designing a new locomotive, with this new engine basically the 8As, but with the superheating, a large boiler similar to the ones fitted to the 8B Atlantics, an increased diameter of the cylinders from 19 to 21 inches, 10-inch diameter piston instead of slide valves, and a small pair of pilot wheels to support the extra weight added to the front. In August 1910, an order was placed at the Central's Gorton Works in Manchester for 20 locomotives to the new 8K design, and in September 1911, the first engine, number 966, rolled out of the shops, and following successful trials, subsequent members will be built to enter service on the GCR's goods work, with 126 built by June 1914, from the works of Gorton, which built 56, Kitson and Company with 20, and the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow with 50, while Geoffrey would be one of the 56 from Gorton when he was outshopped in June 1912 as engine 348. First allocated to Immingham, Geoffrey was used mostly on coal trains between the mines and the docks. In 1914, the previous Sodor and Mainland, Wellsworth and Sudbury, and Tidmouth, Nafford and Elsbridge railways on the island of Sodor were merged to form the North Western Railway, and the first express engine, a K2 called Edward, was loaned from the Furness Railway, leaving a gap in the line's passenger services between Barrow and Lancaster. With various engines having to juggle Edward's original services, it was decided an effort would be made to find another engine to take Edward's place. By sheer coincidence, Geoffrey had once arrived with a coal train for the bunkers at Barrow's shed, and the AK soon got on well with many of the engines, resulting in him being approached by one of the railway's directors and having a shot on passenger runs. While Geoffrey was nervous at first, encouragement from one of Edward's sisters, Sarah, soon got him on board, and once the Great Central consented to his sale, the AK was sent to Sodor's Crovens Gate Works for repainting into his current red livery. Geoffrey was soon trialled on passenger runs between Vicarstown and Lancaster, and was found to work well after some perfections, and this would be his stomping ground for the remainder of the decade, along with some turns on goods trains if a furnace engine broke down. The North Western's formation was something of a strategic exercise, as exactly a month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, World War I was declared on July 28, 1914. This led to the formation of the Railway Operating Division, or ROD, by the Royal Engineers for the mainland side of the conflict. As the war was lasting longer than first thought, and despite 600 engines from the mainland already serving in France, it was decided a dedicated fleet would be needed to assist with the larger deliveries of troops and supplies. Eventually, Sir Sam Fay, who was part of the War Office, settled on the 8Ks as a base due to their robustness, good steaming, and high reliability. With an agreement reached, the first orders of new engines were placed between February and June 1917, with 223 locomotives to be built, followed by a second order for 100 units between February and August 1918, and a final batch of 188 during the autumn of the same year. By the end of the war, a total of 521 examples of this modified design had been built, bringing the total class up to 666 members, with 82 by Robert Stephenson and Company, 32 each by Naismith Wilson and Kitson and Company, only 6 from Gorton, and the remaining 369 from the North British Locomotive Company. All but 14 of the first 325 engines were shipped off to serve in France, and were used on various supply trains to the narrow gauge railways, along with occasional runs on civilian services. Following the end of World War I in November 1918, ROD engines were now being sold as surplus, and many were returned to the mainland, with 3 working for the Great Central as engines 1, 5 and 8, initially 20 for the Great Western, which would become the 3000 class, and 30 to the London North Western Railway as the Class MM. Others arrived following the Big Four grouping, with 148 04s for the London North Eastern Railway from 1925 to 1927, 84 locos being hired to the Great Western prior to the grouping in 1919, for 80 outright purchases in 1925, and 75 to the London Midland and Scottish Railway, mostly for their tenders. Sadly, in a similar manner to the surviving troops, many were traumatized from their experiences in France and would unfortunately suffer numerous panic attacks, requiring regular counselling to help them recover. In 1923, the Furness Railway was absorbed into the as-mentioned London Midland and Scottish Railway as part of the 1921 Railways Act, and with newer engines started to make appearances on the Furness line, the VAT Director thought it best to take Geoffrey under the railway's wing to assist with the goods work and take some pressure off Eagle, a small D5 tender engine from the now former Furness. Geoffrey was thus purchased by the NWR not long after the grouping, and he soon entered traffic on the island's more heavy goods trains, but there had been many occasions where he had to do some of Henry's work due to his constant poor steaming abilities, which the now reclassified 04 couldn't really fault him for. But this finally came to an end in 1935 when Henry was rebuilt at Crewe into a Black 5. Meanwhile, between 1925 and 1927, the Australian-based J.A. Brown, a private coal mining company, purchased 13 ROD 280s to replace the older locomotives running mineral trains on the Richmond Valley Railway, such as a trio of 282 Mikado tank engines inspired by the Great Central 8A. J&A's acquisitions included 9 built by North British, numbered 12 to 20, 1 by Kitson, numbered 21, and the remaining 3 from Gorton, numbered 22 to 24. The first 3 arrived at Sydney as complete engines aboard the SS Burara, where they were later hauled to their new home at Hexham, while the rest came in kit form on J&A Brown's own SS Minmai during its maiden voyage in 1927. And all would gradually be put back together until the final one entered traffic in 1931. However, not all engines were in service at once, with all but 3 in use in 1954, but by this point, the need for coal was beginning to decline, resulting in many mines closing their doors and various parts of the line being ripped up. The fleet would continue working on the remaining sections until they eventually began to be withdrawn by the mid to late 1960s, with the final members officially taken out of service on June 28, 1973, whilst other engines were withdrawn during the 1980s as the Richmond Valley line was gradually closed, bringing an end to commercial steam usage in Australia and making it their own version of the Sandoling Coal Mine Railway in China. Australia wasn't the only country to use surplus ROD 280s, as 30 tenderless engines were sold to Armstrong Whitworth in 1927, before many were shipped off to China and reclassified as KD4s under the China government railways, and probably lasted until withdrawal and scrapping once more powerful locomotives came into the picture. Others saw use in the Middle East, as following the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the War Department was in need of heavy goods engines to transport supplies, resulting in 61 RODs and 31 8Ks being shipped off to Egypt and Palestine, initially working trains between Palestine and Lebanon, before others were later sent to work with the likes of the Iraqi state railways. 1952 saw another 5 RODs shipped to the Middle East, and some were still in traffic around the Suez Canal zone until 1955, when they passed into ownership of the Egyptian State Railways, where the last of them were withdrawn in 1961 and eventually scrapped. Back on the mainland, those RODs who remained there, along with the O4s, continued to see regular use on various goods trains, mostly for shifting the domestic coal supply, later being supplemented in 1922 by the Class 8M, which had bigger but shortened boilers derived from the Class 1 460 10-wheelers, but these were later rebuilt into O4-6s with bell-pair boilers and had height reductions on their cabs. Talking of modifications, the O4s received many during their days on the LNER, with the initial engines being classified as O4-1s, but were later joined by the O4-2s, which had reductions on the cabin boiler for use in Scotland, the O4-3s, which were former ROD 280s but with small bell-pair boilers, the lack of a water scoop and only steam-operated brakes, the O4-4s, which were given the same boilers used on the Gresley O2s, the O4-5s, which had shorter versions of the O2 boilers but kept the original cabs, the O4-7s, which had shorter O2 boilers but kept the GCR smoke boxes, the O4-8s, which were fitted with the same boiler design used on the Thompson B1 460s, and the Thompson 01, which were rebuilt under Edward Thompson with B1 boilers, new cabs, raised running boards, and Wilshart's valve gear, with 58 engines rebuilt between 1944 and 1949. Whilst the 8K and RODs were considered to be reused for the Allies during World War II, this was changed to a more updated design, specifically the London Midland and Scottish Railway Stanier 8Fs, and much like the RODs, many would be assembled at various locations across the mainland, but due to complications from various countries, the 8Fs were gradually superseded by the more useful War Department Austerity 280 and 210 to the design of Robert Riddle's, and the United States Army Transportation Corporation S-160s. Meanwhile, on Sodor, Geoffrey would assist the other engines in shifting his own loads of supplies for the Allies, and was allocated to the Peel-Godred branch line in the absence of Edith, the EE-1, and Eleanor, the EF-1, due to fears of the power grid being disabled, resulting in power being shut off for the railway, and the pair of engines being placed into storage. Geoffrey worked very hard on various iron ore, alumina, steel, and aluminium trains to and from the plant at Peel-Godred, and oil and petrol trains to and from the refinery near the junction. The 8K wasn't alone on the line, as he had some colleagues, in the forms of Lexi, a cab-forward locomotive imported from America to help with the railway's unification, and, towards the end of the conflict, a small fleet of War Department Riddle's Austerity 210Os. With an Allied victory from 1945, plans were made to have Geoffrey repainted back into his red livery to carry on his regular service, but in 1946, representatives from the London North Eastern Railway visited Sodor to negotiate the selling of Geoffrey in order to fill the gap left in the railway's roster, as former North Eastern Railway S3 number 925, formerly known as 98462, and A4 number 4469 Sir Ralph Wedgwood, had both been tragically killed during a bombing raid on York, and the former needed a replacement to assist with rebuilding. Geoffrey, and the Fat Director's successor, Sir Charles Topham would thus consent to this transfer, and the O4 would soon leave the island, entering the LNER stock list as number 3625 on February 8, 1947, and he'd be allocated to goods trains out of Sheffield, Victoria, on the steeply graded Woodhead route to Manchester Piccadilly. Much like those on Sodor during World War II, many of Geoffrey's trains were heavily loaded, requiring both double or triple heading and bankers to be positioned at the back to help him over the likes of the Worsborough Bank. In 1948, Geoffrey and the O4s all came under the ownership of British Railways, with the former Great Western 3000s, which had 46 members left, keeping their numbers, whilst the 328 LNER locomotives and 01 rebuilds became engines 63570 to 63919, with Geoffrey's new number being 63625. Geoffrey would remain at Sheffield until 1955, when electrification of the Woodhead route was finally completed, having started prior to World War II, complemented by the production EM1 and smaller batch of EM2 electric locomotives, later Class 76 and 77 respectively. After this, he was transferred to Retford Thrumpton to run goods trains on his old home of the Great Central Main Line, Though during the same year the Woodhead electrification was completed, the other railway had drafted its modernisation plan under Anthony Eden's Conservative government, which was to have steam replaced by diesels on a like-for-like basis. Withdrawals of the 3000s had begun in 1929, with just over half of the locomotives gone by nationalisation, but mass withdrawals of the remaining 46 likely kicked off following drafting of the modernisation plan, and by 1958 only 5 3000s remained in service: 3011, 3015, 3024, 3036, and 3041, with 36 and 41 being removed in March and the others in October, and all would unfortunately be scrapped by the end of the year. As for the 04s, aside from the 5 being removed in 1952 for shipment to the Middle East, the first official withdrawal came when engine 63668 was taken out of service on December 10th, 1958, and was followed by the withdrawal of 43 locomotives in 1959, including Geoffrey on March 16th, 7 in 1960, 19 in 1961, the biggest batch of 80 in 1962, 28 in 1963, 31 in 1964, 44 in 1965, and the last 12 in 1966, whilst the 01 rebuilds were withdrawn from October 27th, 1962 to November 7th, 1966, with all of the latter also rendered extinct. Following withdrawal, Geoffrey was placed into storage at the Baron Furness scrapyard, where he'd remain until 1976, when back on Sodor, James the Red Engine, a modified former Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 28, was in the works for a much-needed overhaul, which would include the construction of an all-new boiler, but due to the island recovering from the 1973 oil crisis, the VAT controller couldn't afford it. It was then Henry remembered Geoffrey, as he was in the sheds when the 8K was sent back to the LNER, and Bear, the Class 35 Heimerk, would end up finding Geoffrey in the scrapyard during his turn on the midnight goods, and take him back to Sodor. Once on the island, Geoffrey was moved to the Crovansgate Works for restoration, which included repainting back into his vibrant red livery, but with gold lining, while his boiler was also found to be in good nick, only needing the replacement of some boiler tubes and firebox stays. Along with Geoffrey, 4 more 8Ks have also been preserved, the only mainland example being number 102, who was preserved as part of the National Collection upon withdrawal from Frodingham Shed in June 1963, and currently resides on the preserved Great Central Railway, undergoing an overhaul to return them to service. The rest reside in Australia from J.A. Brown as part of the ROD 280s, with one of them, number 21, previously ROD number 1615, who was built at the GCR's Gorton Works in 1918, initially preserved as part of a mining display at Freeman's Waterhole before they were acquired by the Richmond Valley Railway Museum in the mid-1980s, which now runs part of the original Richmond Valley line as a tourist railway. In 1988, plans were put in motion for an operable restoration, but following disassembly, this was eventually deemed too expensive, and the chassis, cab, and tender were stored out of public sight, while the boiler was stored at the museum's workshop until 2016, when they were finally reassembled for static display in the guise of engine number 23, formerly ROD 2004. The other two are number 20, formerly 1984, and Rodney, number 24, formerly 2003, who were both built in 1918 by the North British Locomotive Company and Gorton, respectively. The former of the pair had spent some time on the Lancashire and Yorkshire and London North Western Railways between November 1919 to August 1921, before they and the latter were sent to the land down under to work for J.A. Brown. Lost steaming in 1967 and June 1973 respectively, 1984 and Rodney were preserved at the Dorrigo Steam Railway and Museum, but the museum only opened for a brief period in 1986 before legal troubles over the ownership of engines and other rolling stock by Keith Jones saw it shut up shop. Despite the issues being resolved in 1999, the site is still publicly closed, and is effectively now a holding site, with the ROD engines remaining in unrestored conditions as of 2026, alongside 73 other locomotives, including AD-60 Bayard Garage No. 6039, 19 rail motors, and 280 trucks and coaches, which, by 2017, made up the largest railway collection on Earth, dating between 1877, as the case with Z19 No. 1904, and 1985. In 1977, Geoffrey moved for the first time since 1959, and he soon took over James's traffic, and by the end of the year, his hard work would help generate the funds needed to replace James's damaged boiler, with him returning to service in 1978. Since then, Geoffrey's seen similar duties to Murdoch, albeit on a smaller scale, including turns on passenger runs such as the Moon Racer, with the only task off the table being the modern-day intermodal traffic due to concerns straining his limits. In summary, Geoffrey, similarly to both Edward and Murdoch, is a dependent engine that continues to show his usefulness, while his design also proved to be the perfect basis for his vast war-built siblings, and even after more than 110 years of existence, the Fat Controller still sees him as a really useful engine.